I think I've never seen you, I've never spoken to you, but it seems like I've known you for years.
That's a good thing.
Yeah, I mean, like Edward Said plays a big role in my life. The human part of him, and then the fighting spirit. So I'm seeing Edward Said in you.
Oh, wow. Thank you so much, brother. I really,
So
really
I mean,
appreciate that.
when I was reading forward by Crenshaw, I mean, she was saying that one of his last speeches, he went to UCLA. I tried to find his speech. I mean, it was quite a turbulent kind of session because he was hounded by all those Zionist groups.
There was a standoff. Some Zionist protesters were in the auditorium and were heckling him. It became an issue after his speech. I remember that vividly.
And the spirit, isn't it? He was dying. These are the last days of his life.
This is 2003, right at the sort of cusp, beginning of the war in Iraq. You know, obviously the height of the burgeoning war on terror. I think he died maybe 6 months later. He wrote a beautiful op-ed in the Los Angeles Times. That was really influential in the wake of that speech.
I mean, I teach Middle East politics, and one of the things I try to say that when Edward Said was doing these speeches in different places in America, at the same time, America was hiring people like Bernard Lewis to advise them on Iraq. It's just unbelievable story, isn't it?
Bernard Lewis, Samuel Huntington, Fuad Ajami. It was, yeah. I mean, in retrospect, when you think back on his speech, it was sort of it made his work extremely timely again, because this new sort of like cottage industry of neo-Orientalists, like you said, were being, appointed by the government, by the United States government, to justify the war on terror. Yeah, so that's what made, I think, his visit to UCLA that day so powerful. Is it really made it very crystal clear that his work, his lifelong work, had become more important than ever.
So you are in Detroit now.
I teach at Wayne State University Law School here in Detroit. It's where I grew up. Yeah, so this has been home for better or for worse. The weather is really cold, and I don't like that. Yeah.
So, like, what's your future trajectory you're thinking of? Like, will you move to another places like Colombia, the bigger places?
Yeah, I mean, I would love that. Yeah, I think I'm not sure. I'm tenured law professor. I guess I would like to go to a more globally recognized institute at some point. I'm still relatively young as an academic, so I have some time, I think for that. But yeah, I think being at a law school that is like globally renowned would be of interest to me, and being in a city that is more cosmopolitan, vibrant. Detroit is a working class city, so I think in comparison to cities in the UK, I would liken it most to perhaps maybe like a Manchester, or blue collar, working class roots. Not as sort of like vibrant as London.
But also like lots of like immigrant community as well.
Yeah, huge immigrant communities. We have one of the largest Arab immigrant populations here from places like Palestine, Lebanon, Iraq, Yemen. Big Desi populations. We have a Bengali community in a city called Hamtramck, which is not far from Detroit. But it's a very, even the whites here tend to be very blue collar and working class. But its primary economic lifeline has always been the car industry, and as you know, the auto industry, is going through very significant and transformative sort of shifts, especially with electronic cars. So the big companies here are trying to pivot and adapt to that. So the city economically isn't as vibrant as a San Francisco or New York or even southern cities in the United States. But you have I guess ethnic pockets in the city are relatively vibrant because of the immigrant population. So the Arab population has done a great job sort of stimulating the local economy in a suburb called Dearborn. But the city itself is very stagnant economically.
It's like Ilhan Omar is from the same place you're from.
Rashida Tlaib is from the same city as me, the Palestinian congresswoman.
Okay, she's from
Rashida is.
Yeah.
Ilhan Omar is from Minneapolis, Minnesota.
Okay.
Which is home to a very, very large Somali population.
I mean, you can see like the lives they are living, like Ilhan Omar and like Rashida Tlaib. I mean, the amount of, it's almost like violence, isn't it? Passive violence against them.
Oh yeah, for sure. I think that, for them, they were pioneers. I mean, they were pioneers in the sense that they were the first Muslim Congress women at that level, and very sort of like vocal, unapologetic about their politics. Rashida being Palestinian, Ilhan being a Somali Muhajjaba. And so they rose during the time of Donald Trump, right? And Donald Trump ushered in very frightening sort of culture of Islamophobia. So they were very much at the front lines, and they represented everything that Donald Trump warned against. So they became, political rivals by those on the right.
But also it's like kind of like demography is changing as well. So we'll see like more and more people like Ilhan Omar will be coming to the Congress and like become like senators. And then perhaps, in 50, 60 years time, America will think a bit different way in terms of foreign policy.
I hope so. I mean, yeah, you're exactly right. Demographics are shifting here in the United States. It's becoming more minority majority. I think that people of color, minorities, are more inclined toward running for political office, which is a great thing. Whether that shifts American foreign policy, I think, it's kind of like premature to see. Because I think what it's also done in the negative sense is it sort of mobilized elements on the right to become more xenophobic, Islamophobic, and white supremacist in the United States. You guys have that in Europe, right? Places like Sweden, for instance, and clearly in countries like France, and even in the UK to an extent. When minorities get more power and become more visible politically, what that does is it sort of stimulates and galvanizes hateful elements on the right, and it gives rise to populism. So there's that sort of tension and dialectic going on as well.
So, because I mean, my plan is to just focus on your book. I mean, because this is like, I'm super excited. So I'm like more in the international relations, like international relations of the Middle East, but I'll try to bring Edward's side quite heavily and try to see like what's going on in terms of America's foreign policy, British foreign policy. Like in the way things are here, in this country, like Boris Johnson, if he does partying and all those things, suddenly he becomes very, immoral person. But he can sell billions of dollars, fighter jets into like Saudis or like, which will bomb Yemenis. That's okay. So like these things I try to bring in my, day-to-day, like teaching spaces.
No, that sounds great. I think you'll find that my next book, inshallah, The New Crusades, has a very transnational and international take on these issues and more. It sort of interrogates Islamophobia on a global scale, tied to the war on terror. How did the American war on terror, which started roughly 2 decades ago now, export but also intensify these distinct and disparate Islamophobic campaigns across the world? So the first book that you've read, American Islamophobia, is tied specifically to the American experience, where this new book, takes a global frame as to what's taking place.
Like what's the main drive behind this, like writing this book? I mean, what were you thinking? Because like lots of things happening, isn't it? So suddenly Trump is gone. And then we saw like, new things are opening up in India, China. Obviously, France has got lots of issues. It's like total wasteland if you look at the whole world.
So what drove me to write the book? I think that for me, a couple of things sort of inspired me to write the book. The first was the fact that the first book was beginning in, you know, again, the first book is tied specifically to the American experience. And what I was realizing when I was talking about the book, touring the book, promoting the book, was that what was taking place in the United States had global ramifications, because the American war on terror was by no means just a domestic beast. It was a mission, it was a mandate that had transnational and universal sort of tentacles. And I was speaking to individuals from all over the world, whether it be European nations, people in the Arab world, African countries, and so forth and so on. And I think through those conversations and through my public intellectual presence on social media and beyond, matters of global Islamophobia became just as not only intellectually compelling, but just as pressing to me politically, because I'd realized that the systems, the campaigns, both legal and societal, in places like India, China, Myanmar, the UK, France, Sweden, so forth and so on, we're sort of like manifesting these faces and fronts of Islamophobia that were just as, if not more, damaging than what I had written about in the United States. So during that 2 to 3 year sort of phase in between releasing the first book and talking about the book and promoting it, I had realized that there needed to be a new treatment, a new project that addresses how Islamophobia was unraveling in places across the world. And that gave birth to the idea to write this book.
Like, one of the things I try to find out, like how you combine this, like you're a legal scholar, and then also you're an expert on critical race theory, and also expert on Islamophobia. So like all these things, can you walk us through like how these three things can actually help try to, pinpoint that, okay, here is the problem?
Yeah, so if you kind of think about those three distinct spheres as almost a Venn diagram, right? These three spheres, like you mentioned, you have law on one hand, you have critical race theory on the other, and then finally, third, you have Islamophobia, three spheres that overlap. There's a really interesting and powerful convergence between these three spheres, where, from my estimation, the law is the sort of central and most powerful catalyst in sort of advancing racial, religious, geopolitical inequity, right? So whether it's laws like wars, right? Whether it be, war is sort of state action. It is, it's enabled by law. There has to be legislation and then the will on the part of the executive here in the United States, the way constitutional law works, to justify war in Iraq, war in Afghanistan, and this broader war on terror, which is a lot sloppier than those conventional wars. So the law enables Islamophobia to have practical effect. You need law in order for campaigns like Islamophobia to have practical effect. So that is the tether between law and Islamophobia, especially when we talk about what I call structural Islamophobia, right? State-sponsored Islamophobia through, cogent policies like war, cogent policies like legislation, travel bans, Muslim bans, counter-radicalization policing, which you guys in the UK call and this is structural state-sponsored Islamophobia. Critical race theory's convergence with these two areas is that we've been living in a world where Muslim identity has been deeply racialized for centuries, right? And that sort of like interrogates and ties where Edward Said's Orientalism comes into play. There's a very entrenched, venerable construction for Muslim identity that's rooted in Orientalism, the idea that Muslims are barbaric, warmongering, prone to terror, savage, backwards people that are a monolith, that are sort of like wed to this nonstop, everlasting crusade and fight against the West. That's how Muslims have been racially imagined by Orientalism. And obviously that's been, these Orientalist tropes, which have been existing for a long time, have been redeployed in the post 9/11 context through this broader legal system of Islamophobia. And that's how these three spheres converge and interact. For me, what motivated me to interrogate Islamophobia from a legal and a critical race theory perspective is when I came into legal academia during the height of the war on terror, there were very few critical legal scholars engaging the racial legal construction of Muslim identity, and that's what really motivated me to want to fill that void.
Like, I mean, I'm not expert on this kind of area, but my understanding is like the way I see it. If something becomes like legal, like for example, like self-defense, America's idea about self-defense, like someone attacked them, so that means legally they can defend themselves. But then they try to say that, okay, some of the self-defense are like preeminent. So in that case, I can, like that kind of like Bush doctrine that I can preempt my self-defense. So if you construct Muslims or Islam as a kind of that kind of area that they are terrorist or potential terrorist, that means legally you can actually trigger those self-defense against Muslims. Does it make sense? Like
perfect sense. Yeah, and exactly that is the logic behind Islamophobia in sort of my framing of Islamophobia, which is tied to how then President George W. Bush sort of framed this new construction of Muslim identity tethered to suspicion of terrorism, right? And remember that, President Bush was sort of the modern architect of the preemptive strike doctrine, right? We get them before they're able to sort of like evolve and reach the potential of being full-fledged terrorists. So if Muslims sort of carry this suspicion of terrorism as a consequence of how they look and how they believe, then it becomes justifiable and legitimate for American governments and Western actors to bomb them before they do anything wrong, right? And that logic is not only tied to war; it's tied to surveillance and policing. In the UK with Prevent, right? The entire sort of logic of Prevent and counter-radicalization policing is to encroach upon the spaces, the communities, the civil liberties of Muslims before they commit any wrong, because we have to do it in order to prevent them from becoming full-fledged radicals and terrorists.
So like once it's been structured, then what's the consequence of this? Like, I mean, then what's the result of this?
Well, there's a range of, from the perspective of Muslim communities, there's a range of, really perilous consequences. One of the, as a legal scholar, the most perilous legal concerns are direct compromises on civil liberties and constitutional rights, right? So here in the United States, the Constitution is built upon what's called the First Amendment, the idea that, every citizen, every resident, regardless of which faith they profess, is guaranteed the right to freely exercise their faith, engage in free speech, engage in free assembly. So let's talk about those three rights with regard to Muslims, right? When Muslims freely exercise their religion in the war on terror context, that invites suspicion. That invites policemen, CIA, FBI, CIA, surveillance elements in different countries to come into their space and compromise their right to freely exercise their faith. It also compromises speech, because when Muslims are engaged in any kind of critical activity, protest, dissident activity, let's say that Muslims want to protest the war in Iraq, or we want to protest, English engagement in the war in Afghanistan. That's going to signal possible suspicion to the state. Why are these Muslims, not being patriotic and critiquing our domestic and wartime policy? So legally speaking, it has the direct effect of compromising rights that are protected by Constitution and charters in Western countries. I think another practical effect is it has a divide and conquer strategy, right? So, scholars like Mahmoud Mamdani have talked about the good versus bad Muslim binary, and governments like the American and the British and the French governments are really sort of clever in recruiting elements within the Muslim community who want to sort of play ball and advance their interests and their policy, and Muslims who don't and remain critical and rightfully critical are considered bad Muslims.
So, like, I mean, another important, like, pertinent question can be, so once these things are constructed, then it's kind of easy for America to go for that global war on terror, because that kind of, now we have to do it. And it looks like what America did last 20 years. They spent $8 trillion, killed 900,000 people, went after 12 countries. These are mostly like Muslim countries. These are the poorest of the poorest countries in the world. I mean, what the hell is that? I mean,
that's exactly right. I think that the real sort of meta horror of the war on terror is that by branding vulnerable, impoverished, marginalized people as potential terrorists, we're able then to commit the most atrocious crimes against them, right? A defenseless people. We see that in places like Yemen, which is the poorest country in the Arab world, right? Which has been decimated by American drones, which has been abetted by, one of the United States' principal ally in the region, Saudi Arabia. You saw this happen in Myanmar with the Rohingya population to promote ethnic cleansing, again, of a defenseless and poor people. And not only the United States, but right, the collateral effect is that governments like Burma, governments in India, governments in China, adopt this sort of like logic and language of terrorism that they ascribe to Muslim populations. And oftentimes these Muslim populations in these countries are relatively poor, right? They're relatively afforded less protection than the majority religious or ethnic population in those states. And then you see them being pummeled, ethnically cleansed, and in some cases, victims of genocide. So that's the real sort of, most sort of nefarious dimension of this global war on terror, is that the real victims of the war on terror are not well-to-do, middle and upper class Muslim populations. It's not that. These are the poorest of the poor that have been the disproportionately gravest victims of this war.
So like, and then you try to like, I mean, obviously it looks like in your new book, you will bring intersectionality as well in terms of international, this kind of a structure where India, China, and other countries are doing the same kind of template they're using. I mean, what's the game here? What's the end game for India, for example?
Well, the end game is like, I think it's critical, and that's why structural Islamophobia is such an important piece of this conversation. Is I think in the lay discourse, we think of Islamophobia as an irrational form of animus, fear, or bigotry. But what's happening on the structural side of things when governments wield Islamophobia is very rational. They use it as a political instrument to advance their distinct interests. In places like India, the objective is to install and to expand a Hindu nation, Hindustan, right? So Islamophobia, this fear-mongering of Muslims, this stripping of rights of indigenous Indian Muslim populations is to again use this rubric of terrorism to enable the Hindutva supremacist regime to bulldoze mosques, bulldoze homes, strip rightful citizenship from Muslim populations and communities, justify headscarf bans, throw journalists who are engaged in critical journalism and dissidents in prison, to install or expand the RSS vision of a Hindu nation, right? An ethno-supremacist state like we see in places like Israel, for instance, or China is an ethno-supremacist state, or South Africa before apartheid was abolished. That is the objective, to use Islamophobia as a rational instrument and tool to legitimize these what amount to human rights crimes.
Like, I mean, I'm not sure like whether this would be fair to you like to ask this question. Like in terms of economic side of the story, I'm reading like recent statistics. It looks like 20% of world's population now own 95% of the world's wealth. So basically 80% now actually rely on 5% of the world's wealth. So, I mean, do you think India, China, those things are now churning up big way because of the resource scarcity? And then that can kind of, knock-on effect on all those like racial hatred, bigotry, and all those bad things can actually come back in the society and try to tear it apart. Did you think a bit on that kind of thing as well?
I think that, economics and global economics always have a critical role in, how can I say this? Like, war, ethnic cleansing, and demographic reengineering crusades. And I think China is, a very stark example of that. So what are the economic dimensions of China cracking down, persecuting the Uyghur Muslim population in East Turkestan, or what the Chinese call Xinjiang? One of the reasons for the genocide is Xinjiang occupies a very strategically important sort of sphere for the Chinese government, right? It runs along, in addition to being rich in resources, a whole range of resources, it's a main sort of like thoroughfare for the Bridge and Road Initiative, right? This sort of like global architectural program where China expands, exports its goods, expands its influence. It needs it, right? It needs that land in order to sort of like, maintain the physical integrity of the Bridge Road Initiative. And that has considerable economic ramifications, right? If East Turkestan, if the Uyghur people, for instance, get their way, they claim self-determination, let's say East Turkestan becomes a free and sovereign state, that disrupts the continuity of the Bridge Road Initiative, right? So they need that land in order to make the BRI is what it is. And that is a huge geopolitical and economic sort of program for China, if not the leading one, and very much an economic lifeline for the country's domestic economic fare, but also its geopolitical aspirations. So clearly, like all these persecution programs in these countries have an economic tentacle. In India, it's less conspicuous, to be honest with you. I mean, I'm not an expert on India domestic politics, but my guess, based on what I've read in research, is once you relegate the Muslim population as second-class citizens, that creates greater opportunity for members of the Hindu population to claim those positions, right? Once you tear down mosques or tear down Muslim homes, especially in areas that are where real estate value is high or economically valuable. Kashmir is a classic example of that, right? So Kashmir is valuable for a range of reasons. Once you decimate villages in a place like Kashmir and build Hindu towns and villages, then these become tourist destinations that can generate considerable revenue for the Hindu government, but also its its private sort of interlocutors. So economics always has a considerable, if not a leading role in all of these discussions.
That's quite interesting, because I mean, it kind of looks like, if you can construct them as terrorists, then that means you can go after them and disposes them, and then eventually you can accumulate wealth from that disposition. It's a kind of cycle they can create.
Well, it's a chain, right? Because once you classify them as terrorists, that enables you to imprison them, to level their homes, to knock down their mosques. And then you're doing it under the pretenses or the guise of it being legitimate. It's no longer a criminal act. It's not criminal to bulldoze a mosque that is associated with terrorism, or to level the home of an individual who might be tied to Al-Qaeda or ISIS, right? And then once you've done that, you can then build an institution that becomes economically lucrative for you, right? It's a human rights crime if you just bulldoze a home to bulldoze a home because you want it economically. It kind of goes along the logic of, I think Israel is doing it kind of indiscriminately now.
It's a kind of like it's kind of like self-defense for Israel, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. For Israel, it's these guys might be terrorists. We need to knock down this home because terrorists live there, so it's self-defense. But all these logics are very similar and tied to the idea that Arab identity, Muslim identity manifest this fear of terrorism.
I'm like area of time. Like one of the things I'm really interested about, like, the style of your writing. I quite like, the way you are, you tell stories and then you bring like all those academic like rigor as well. I mean, where did this come from, this style?
Yeah, so I published extensively in legal journals for a long time. And I recognized, I guess midway through my legal academic career that academic writing is not accessible to large groups and audiences of people that I would like to reach. I think that for me, and I've written this in the public sphere, that my only interest in academia is the platform it gives to do public intellectual work. My heroes were people like Edward Said and like Kim Crenshaw, James Baldwin, very accomplished and rigorous scholars who were then able to leverage their work to reach audiences and specifically populations that don't have the privilege of attending these really elite universities. So once I recognized that that was my real sort of objective as a thinker, that came with the hard work that I had to sort of adjust my writing when writing in the public sphere, and sort of distill my writing and be strategic and thoughtful about how I can tell these stories in ways that can capture the imagination and resonate with the school teacher, the binman, the activist who didn't attend college or university, the poor person living in a village in Lebanon or in Pakistan, who was very politicized, but couldn't afford, to pay rates to go to college or university. For me, I was very mindful of writing in a way that could reach all sorts of audiences. I didn't want to be a sort of like elite ivory tower scholar.
I think that makes like so accessible as well, and also like like trying to connect your audience with those characters, with those real life people. I still remember like from your first book, like American Islamophobia, this like Uber driver you mentioned about someone called Ban. So I was planning to ask you that question, that did you have any closure from him? Did he come back, or anything happened to him?
Yeah, I spoke to him a couple of times years later. And, what's funny about that story is I've had so many stories like that take place since then, where I met strangers, young people. And I'm not a Islamic law scholar, you know what I mean? I'm not like this walking poster boy for, dawah or, I guess Muslim devoutness, but because the work that I do, I guess I attract people who are curious in the deen, which is a wonderful thing, I think. Ironically enough, like my hero Edward Said probably had the same things happen to him, even though he was a Palestinian Christian, right? But yeah, the last I heard from that young man was 3 years ago. He was studying Islam and considering conversion.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if he actually did or not, but I know that he went on to graduate school studying social work, I believe it is. But yeah, and that's the beauty of writing these books. And for me, telling these stories is you meet this rich array of people from all over the world who are impacted by Islamophobia in very distinct ways. And that's where intersectionality comes into play, right? That our experiences as Muslims all over the world dealing with Islamophobia is dramatically different. This is somebody who was Latino, living in Los Angeles, undocumented, on the cusp of becoming Muslim. His experience with Islamophobia is dramatically different than yours or mine. Us being relatively comfortable academics. So yeah, those stories, and that's I think you'll find in this book, inshallah, when you read it, is the stories are far more pervasive and far more focal to the writing, and I'm really happy for that.
I mean, without giving like much a spoiler, can you tell us, because you mentioned about 2 Tuesdays, like I know one Tuesday is like 9/11. What's the other Tuesday?
Well, one Tuesday is 9/11, and the other Tuesday is the bombing in Lebanon. If you recall that explosion in Lebanon a couple of years back, and I'm half Lebanese. And if you recall, and I spent 2 years of my life living in Lebanon during the war. And that experience, and that took place, and I was in the United States when that explosion took place. If you remember in the beginning, before they uncovered that explosion was a consequence of negligence, there were reports that it might have been a terror attack by an element like Hezbollah or Al-Qaeda. So I situate both Tuesdays in, the sort of like psychological episode Muslims have to always, sort of like travel and experience whenever an atrocity like that takes place, because the immediate sort of inclination from Western media outlets is that things like that are an act of terrorism.
Mm.
And before the truth is uncovered, we're always dealing with the stress of, is it a Muslim? What happens if it is a Muslim? How's my government going to respond? What does this mean for me when I walk into work tomorrow? So the book, just sort of like 2 decades after the War on Terror, goes through that same existential sort of play that every Muslim's play a role in. Something like that takes place.
Like, I mean, I'm not sure, like it might be a kind of idea for your next book. I mean, after 9/11, like my story is, I was walking just outside of my campus, and then a bunch of young guys surrounded me and chanted like Osama, Osama, Osama. I mean, obviously I was terrified, and I was just not sure like what to do with this. I mean,
yeah.
And like another of my like classmate, he went to London in the same week, and he came back to Dundee with a broken leg and a broken hand.
Oh wow!
He was from Libya. So that's like intersection. How something happened in New York, how it affected someone from in Dundee, coming out from his campus, and someone like visiting his family members in London came back to Dundee with a broken leg and broken hand.
Yeah, I think that's one of the scariest sort of dimensions of Islamophobia, and it being transnational, in that regardless of where we are and where we live and who we are, that's something that takes place on the opposite side of the world, could directly impact our immediate lives in very frightening ways, right? If it's a bomb that takes place in Lebanon and a Muslim actually committed it, and let's say, Christians or white people were killed, then that's going to rile up the anger and the Islamophobia of the locals in cities we live in, to vandalize our mosques, attack our family members, and maybe attack us. And that's been an ongoing sort of like, one of the ugliest narratives of Islamophobia being this transnational beast.
So like what to do with this? Like what's your like what kind of solution we are looking here? I mean, how big the project is to resolve this situation?
Well, I think there is no long-term resolution, to be honest with you, right? I think that people talk about how, whether it's racism, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, anti-Black racism, whatever it is, like all these sort of systems of othering and difference cannot be entirely extinguished for as long as they're politically and geopolitically useful for political campaigns, parties, governments. And they're always going to be useful to an extent, because there's always going to be some sort of opportunist or demagogue that seizes upon, especially during moments of economic downturn, right? Moments of economic downturn are typically the most conducive for fomenting this kind of Islamophobic or racial or xenophobic fear-mongering. Whenever it's politically useful for somebody with power or in power to rile up the state, they're going to do it. Right? I think that there is no, and again, like this is not a pessimistic take, but very much a realistic one. And I'm somebody who believes, like I'm Muslim, and I'm a spiritual being and believe in the sort of precarity of the dunya, that we're never going to reach perfection or full-fledged resolution in this place. But I think that what we have to do as Muslims, not only as Muslims, but as conscious people, is number one, to remain vigilant, right? Remain vigilant and know that in sort of in a second's time, in a minute's time, things can very much turn for the worse. Second, it's incumbent upon us to sort of, especially for those of us living in Western societies, England, Scotland, Canada, the United States, Australia, France, so forth and so on. If these places are going to be our home, then we have to be very strategic and intentional of gaining positions of power in these spaces that are our home. Because when we occupy positions of power, we're able to sort of, not entirely resolve, but at least alleviate the negative impact of these forms of hate. The fact that you're a professor at a university, that's very powerful, right? Because we as scholars get to educate the next crop of citizens and judges and prosecutors and statesmen and stateswomen, will be sort of like, their perspective will be impacted and colored by the way in which we teach. And that's really important. That's why we talked about Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib earlier on, right? And they're flawed. They've made mistakes, but they've made considerable contributions in the spaces that they occupy, right? They're pioneers in those spaces. So that's the second thing we have to do, is to claim power in these Western societies and communities where we call home. And I think third, deal with the really sobering yet honest recognition that unless it's us that seeks to educate, serve as ambassadors, and impact public attitudes, but also policy, nobody else is going to do it. I hear a lot of young people say, it's not my responsibility as a Muslim to educate these racists and these hate mongers. And my response is, okay, if you're not going to do it, who else is going to do it then? Do you think the government's committed to that? Do you think the BBC or CNN is committed to, portraying Muslims in an objective, positive light? So the world is not fair. The dunya is not fair and equal. The responsibility lies on our shoulders to impact attitudes and impact policies best we can. And I think that's not how we bring about resolution, because there is no permanent resolution, but that's how we can impact things for the better.
Small things I really want to ask, like you are quite vocal in social media. Sometimes I worry about you. You're taking too much. You're taking too much.
Yeah.
Will you be okay there?
Inshallah, like, everything's in Allah's hands. You know what I mean? I think for me, again, I chose a lot. I chose this life of being a public intellectual and a public figure, and it comes with positives and it comes with a lot of negatives. And one of the negatives is you have to be private about your private life. Second, to protect loved ones. The second dimension is you're always going to be, especially when you're on the road and especially when you're giving public speeches, there's always going to be that specter of violence that exists. I've had many run-ins, especially when the first book was published and I was promoting the book. Will I be okay? Yeah, I think so. I mean, but whatever is written is written. And I'm actually consoled by that. I'm consoled by the fact that I don't try to control what I can't control, but I won't let fear silence me. I think that for me, I feel that it's an obligation for me to do the work that I do. And I feel like it's God's work. I feel like in many respects, it's a labor of love, but it's also a labor of devotion as well.
But I mean, it looks like, you have got this like Detroit fighting spirit. So hope it stays strong with you forever. Inshallah. Yeah. So, I mean, thank you so much, Professor Beydoun. I mean, absolute pleasure. I'm still learning these things. These are very technical stuff, but hopefully, I'll read more. And also, I try to ask my students to read your books as well. And hopefully, one day I will invite you to Dundee to, give us a talk here.
I would love to come. Yeah.
Scotland is in summer. It's very pretty, very beautiful, very calming.
Yeah, I've always wanted to visit Scotland. So inshallah.
So I'll be your host. Absolutely. I'll take care of you.
I appreciate that. I would love to come.
Thank you so much. Absolute pleasure. Okay. You take care. Okay. Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.